Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're delving into one of the most compelling works ever written to bridge Eastern and Western ethical systems, Inazo Nitobe's 1900 classic Bushido, The Soul of Japan. Writing in English, Nitobe sought to explain the moral code of the samurai by finding parallels in European chivalry and Christian philosophy, effectively aiming to distill a vast cultural tradition into a universal framework.
And that very effort, that act of, distillation and translation for a specific audience at a very specific moment in history is precisely what mandates our caution today.
Our central question, therefore, is this. Does Nitobe's highly codified, late-stage presentation of Bushido stand as a reliable, universally applicable, and, timeless ethical system capable of guiding modern professional life, ethical leadership, and personal resilience? My perspective is that the framework provides a powerful foundational moral compass whose utility really transcends its origins.
And I believe we must approach it with necessary skepticism, recognizing it primarily as an idealized Meiji-era reconstruction whose historical inaccuracies and, frankly, undeniable geopolitical baggage fundamentally limit its reliability for modern application.
Nitobe's real accomplishment was to synthesize what were often disparate strands of philosophy, we're talking Confucianism, Buddhism, and Shintoism, into 7 core virtues that speak directly to the human desire for a structured moral life. We have rectitude, gi, respect, rei, courage, yu, honor, meiyo, benevolence, jin, honesty, makoto, and loyalty, chugi. And these principles are defined with exceptional clarity. For example, rectitude is the power of deciding upon a certain course of conduct in accordance with reason without wavering. Courage is clearly defined not just as bravery, but as doing what is right even when it's difficult. These are profoundly moral statements, not simply historical curiosities. In the modern organizational context, they provide the backbone for ethical decision-making, ensuring integrity and risk management, and forcing leaders to pursue a long-term vision rooted in tangible core values rather than just short-term gains. The fact that figures like Theodore Roosevelt and JFK were influenced by this work, it confirms its capacity to speak across cultures and time.
I see why you emphasize that cross-cultural appeal and the elegance of the 7 virtues. I do. But to rely on this system for modern ethical guidance, we have to acknowledge that scholars overwhelmingly view Nitobe's work as an idealized and, a romanticized reconstruction, not a simple transmission of ancient tradition. We must remember the context. Nitobe was a Christian educator writing this explicitly for a Western audience in 1900. The Meiji Restoration was transforming Japan, and he was engaged in cultural diplomacy, demonstrating that Japan's rapid modernization was built upon a sophisticated moral foundation, not mere technological imitation.
That political and diplomatic goal, it necessitated crafting a bridge.
A bridge that drew its materials from centuries of Japanese thought. Indeed, but those materials were filtered. Scholarly debates contend that the formalized ethical system presented was, quote, largely formulated during the late 19th century as part of Japan's intense nation-building efforts. More importantly, his reliance on Christian theological concepts, for instance his extensive efforts to compare benevolence, or jin, to Christian charity, risks subtly but critically distorting the original Japanese concepts. The traditional Confucian emphasis on duty and ritualistic propriety, for example, is perhaps softened by a focus on Western notions of universal, sentimental kindness. If we adopt this framework, we are adopting a construction, not a pure historical reality, and that construction was built with specific political biases toward a Western viewpoint.
Appreciate the depth of that historiographical caveat. I do. But the debate here is about utility. Does the philosophical purity of the historical application truly negate the moral power of the articulated ideal? When Nitobe elevates rectitude, or gi, as the bone that gives firmness and stature, he is identifying the foundational moral architecture necessary for any successful enterprise, whether that enterprise is a feudal domain or a global corporation. In a modern complex environment defined by ambiguity and rapid change, rectitude becomes essential for mental resilience. It gives leaders the fortitude to say no to ambiguous demands or corrupting influences, because gi provides a rational, unchanging metric for conduct. Courage, yu, is useless if it is not guided by that righteousness. It just becomes bravado or recklessness. These ideals resonate because they are fundamental mechanisms for maintaining integrity under pressure.
That's a compelling argument for the aspiration, but we must interrogate the historical structural integrity of the code itself before we build modern resilience on it. If we're adopting a code, we have to evaluate its practical basis. The substantial gap between the ethical ideals and the historical reality of the samurai is often cited. Historical records suggest samurai conduct was often dictated by pragmatic concerns, political maneuvering, and sheer survival, frequently flying in the face of these noble statements. For instance, the very foundation of loyalty, which you hold up, was often conditional and pragmatic, based on feudal contracts and personal advantage rather than absolute spiritual devotion. If we are basing our modern standard on this ideal, we are importing a standard that even the original expert practitioners of the code frequently failed to meet or uphold consistently.
But doesn't that critique apply equally to every foundational ethical system we respect today? Are we suggesting that because historical figures failed to meet the standards of the Stoics or the principles of the Republic, that we should abandon the ideal entirely? That seems like a radical dismissal. I think you're confusing human frailty with philosophical invalidity. The rectitude principle still provides clarity and guidance, regardless of whether a feudal lord chose to violate it for personal gain. The system functions as a benchmark, a guidepost, not a descriptive history.
I would counter that. The unique problem here is that the framework itself, in its 1900 presentation, claims to be the soul of a historical class, which makes the disjunction between ideal and reality more acute. When we speak of resilience today, we need systems that are robust against inevitable failure. If the core principle of feudal loyalty was inherently conditional, a contractual obligation that could be broken if the lord failed his duty, then applying Nitobe's unconditional description of loyalty, or chugi, to a modern organization, well, it risks creating undue, potentially damaging pressure on employees to sacrifice self-interest for a flawed corporate entity.
That brings us directly to the interpretation of loyalty, of chugi. I define it as the willing surrender of personal interest in service of a legitimate higher cause. In a modern context, this translates powerfully to organizational commitment, fostering strong, cohesive team dynamics and establishing a shared purpose that transcends mere individual self-interest. That concept of service is vital because it transforms a job into a mission.
But can we truly abstract that principle of loyalty from the context of its interpreter? This is where the structural flaws become difficult to ignore, moving from historiography to geopolitics. While we may strive to separate the philosophy from the personal, Nitobe was not merely a passive interpreter. He was a strong advocate for Japanese colonialism.
Now you're focusing on his later political actions rather than the text itself.
I would argue that his politics informed the purpose and dissemination of the text. He explicitly used his platform, the same platform that elevated Bushido, to describe the Korean people as primitive, arguing that Japan was on a noble civilizing mission. The danger is that the rigid, unquestioning duty inherent in the Meiji-era elevation of chugi was directly deployed to justify the subjugation and dismissal of entire nations. If we adopt this framework uncritically, we risk importing an uncritical acceptance of hierarchy and duty that historically led to profound injustices and the marginalization of other groups. That context is a constraint on its universal reliability.
I approach this differently. If we were to discard every major philosophy whose proponents or interpreters used its tenets to justify horrific actions, our ethical toolbox would be empty. The principle of self-sacrifice in service to a legitimate higher good, that is the core teaching, is independent of Nitobe's flawed definition of what constituted a legitimate cause. In modern business, we redefine the higher cause as ethical corporate social responsibility or mission-driven sustainability. If we apply chugi to reinforce integrity against corrupting internal influences, the principle remains sound, even if the author was personally flawed. We harvest the ethical fruit while discarding the author's geopolitical weeds.
If we shift from political expansion to economic application, we find another core structural weakness in the Bushido framework. You rightly point out its explicit disdain for profit and commerce is often praised as a moral strength, a counter to modern utilitarianism. Nitobe placed the merchant lowest in the category of vocations and stated that, by riches, that wisdom is hindered.
And that is precisely the moral clarity needed today, a necessary counterbalance to the incessant drive toward pure materialism. It shifts the focus from wealth accumulation to character development, prioritizing personal dignity, Meiji, and integrity over short-term financial gain. It establishes a necessary hierarchy where moral capital supersedes financial capital.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the anti-materialism is a strength for modern markets. Historically, that ethical disdain for economy directly resulted in significant practical flaws in its adoption. The samurai's utter disregard of economy, their belief that the counting of money was left to meaner hands, created what was later characterized as a loose business morality. And why? Because when the highest moral class, the samurai, scorned practical economics and accounting, they left those duties to others whom they deemed lower and less honorable. This lack of oversight, driven by this ethical snobbery, actually plagued early Japanese foreign trade with a deficit of transparency and rigor.
I would frame that as a failure of integration, not an inherent flaw in the virtue itself. The spirit of Bushido had not yet permeated the merchant class, which was operating on different, less honorable standards.
The material suggests otherwise. It shows that when honest samurai attempted to transition into commerce after the edict abolishing feudalism, they signally and irrevocably failed. This was not just the failure of the merchant class, it was a systemic failure of the code itself to grapple with practical industrial virtue. An ethical system that actively scorns and excludes pragmatic considerations like finance, sustainability, and wealth generation is fundamentally insufficient for guiding modern markets. To seek ethical guidance for business, we need a code that understands and dignifies the creation of wealth through honorable means, not one that actively dismisses it.
But this is where the modern application corrects the historical oversight. The failure of the samurai in commerce simply illustrates what happens when the principles are applied rigidly and without adaptation. The modern impulse toward corporate social responsibility, CSR, and movements like B Corps are ironically an attempt to reintegrate the Bushido spirit, rectitude, honesty, and benevolence back into the economic sphere. We are seeking to merge the financial acumen that the samurai lacked with the moral priority they championed. Nitobe's framework provides the moral compass that prevents commerce from devolving into purely self-interested utilitarianism, thereby redeeming the spirit of the code through responsible capitalism.
So you are asking us to rely on the modern world to fix the core historical inadequacy of the code rather than seeking a framework that was inherently designed to handle complexity and economy from the start. That requires immense discernment. If the code was meant to guide leadership, it failed to lead its adherents through the most significant economic transition in their history.
So we've rigorously covered the tensions between idealism and application. While the discussion makes it clear that historical context and scholarly critique are vital for responsible adoption, I maintain that the essence of Bushido, the 7 core virtues, remains a powerful and enduring set of ideals. They provide the necessary architecture for developing profound personal character, offering mental resilience by grounding actions in rational principle, and upholding the integrity essential for any lasting organization in an age obsessed with speed and superficiality. The light of the chivalry, surviving its feudal mother institution and adapting to new forms, still offers a potent moral path.
The challenge for our listeners lies in that exact discernment. We must recognize Nitobe's Bushido as a highly successful yet politically and culturally specific 19th century intellectual response, a brilliant work of cultural diplomacy. Adopting it wholesale risks overlooking its idealized nature and, more gravely, ignoring the clear historical evidence that its rigid interpretation of loyalty and duty was used to justify colonial expansion and the marginalization of other groups. True modern ethical guidance, particularly in global contexts, requires rigorously challenging all assumptions about hierarchy and duty, even those contained within venerated traditions.
The material clearly demonstrates that the influence of Nitobe's Bushido persists, from popular culture to sophisticated business ethics, and it invites that rigorous engagement.
Indeed. And it compels us all to continue considering which philosophical foundations best serve the complex path toward truly ethical and sustainable leadership today.